the Chancellor will be looking at the pay review body's recommendations and will come to Parliament before the end of July to set out her response.
I mean, I'm looking at the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. Prime Minister to hand teachers and nurses bumper pay rise. Just over 500,000 teachers, 1.36 NHS workers. Rachel Reeves was on another channel this morning. She hasn't knocked this down, so we should expect, shouldn't we, that you are going to find the money somehow for this 5.5% pay rise.
Well, look, I don't want to preempt the Chancellor's process of looking at the pay review body's recommendations.
Yeah, but she's preempted herself because she hasn't denied it.
So without further ado, the Chancellor is today launching a review into pensions and investment as part of what Rachel Reeves is calling a big bang of reforms to unlock growth. But with growth the key to all the government's plans, how long should we be expected to wait for it? And is there any money to spend in the meantime? James Murray is the Exchequer Secretary of the Treasury, and he joins us. Good morning to you, Mr. Murray.
Cheers, thank you very much. Hi, good morning.
Can I ask you first of all about universities? Lead story in the Sunday Times saying 40% now are approaching crisis point in terms of funding. Is there anything that can be done?
Well, look, this is clearly an issue that we've inherited from the last government, and it will be one that ministers will now have to pay attention to and to work out what can be done to make sure that universities are sustainable in terms of their funding, and obviously considering the contribution that students make as well.
I mean, do you think having universities operating with their present number of students, both domestic and foreign, is sustainable given the economic circumstances of the country?
Well, I think there's a lot of different issues at play here in terms of who the students are, you know, how repayments work for students, how the university's funding is sustainable or not. There's a complex set of issues which are interwoven there, and it will be obviously a priority for the ministers and the new government to look at that. You know, we know this is one of many inheritances that we've found upon taking office, and it's one of those that we need to look at now that we are in government.
I mean, the problem is universities are saying they're going bust now, and there seem to be two choices, really. One is to let them get more foreign students by lifting the ban on students being able to bring their families into the country, which the last government brought in. Is there any chance Labour might reverse that?
So look, you're right to say that this is a priority. This is something which is urgent. There are unfortunately a lot of things which are urgent priorities we need to give attention to now as a government. I don't want to preempt what my colleagues will say about this particular matter, but it is one of the many issues which is part of the very difficult inheritance that we've had. You know, the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War, and we will be paying our attention to that.
So on foreign students, will you make it easier for them to come to this country with their families?
Well, look, I'm not going to preempt what my colleagues will say about the response to the situation universities are facing. You know, what I'm clear about is that this is one of those urgent issues that we need to look at. But as I say, there are many urgent issues because the inheritance that we've had couldn't be harder.
I do want to ask you just one final question about universities, something I genuinely don't know the answer to. What is the Labour government's attitude on tuition fees, student tuition fees, which are being paid? Are they at the right level? Do they need to be reduced, or do they need to be increased, which would actually get around some of the financial problems?
Well, I think what we recognise as we set out during the general election campaign is that some of the ways in which students repay tuition fees puts some students in a difficult position. So we want to look at the system of repayments to make sure that that is done in the right way, in a way that minimises the way in which some students are in a difficult position. But really, the question about tuition fees is part of the wider set of interrelated issues which we've been talking about for the last few minutes, which need to be looked at in the round. And as I say, one of the many priority issues we need to look at as a new government.
Yeah, and there's no philosophical position because, as you know, tuition fees at just over £9,000 have not gone up with inflation. I mean, should they go up with inflation?
Well, look, we have to look at all the detail of what we've inherited. And, you know, I think let's just be clear that with all the decisions that we are going to need to take in the coming weeks, months, years, we are starting from what we've inherited. We are starting from an incredibly difficult set of circumstances. One of the first things the Chancellor did on taking office was to instruct Treasury officials to do a comprehensive assessment, comprehensive analysis of the state of public finances and public spending. We knew we were going to inherit a difficult situation. Everything we've seen so far since taking office has confirmed our expectation of what a difficult situation we would inherit. So there's going to be a lot of difficult decisions because of the financial situation we've inherited.
So can this government afford the 5.5% that we understand has been recommended by the pay review bodies?
So there's a process for looking at those recommendations, and that's what the Chancellor is doing. The Chancellor is looking at the pay review body's recommendations, and she will set out her response to Parliament by the end of the month. That will be in the context of the assessment of the state of public finances and public spending that I just mentioned. But in that context of what we've inherited, the Chancellor will be looking at the pay review body's recommendations and will come to Parliament before the end of July to set out her response.
I mean, I'm looking at the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. Prime Minister to hand teachers and nurses bumper pay rise. Just over 500,000 teachers, 1.36 NHS workers. Rachel Reeves was on another channel this morning. She has knocked this down, so we should expect, shouldn't we, that you are going to find the money somehow for this 5.5% pay rise?
Well, look, I don't want to preempt the Chancellor's process of looking at the pay review body's recommendations.
Yeah, but she's preempted herself because she hasn't denied it. So you surely could.
Well, no, the Chancellor's been very clear that there is a process of looking at the pay review body's recommendations, and the Chancellor's also been very clear that whilst obviously response to those recommendations involves a cost, there is also a cost to not striking a deal. If you don't strike a deal, you run the risk of further industrial action and obviously issues around recruitment and retention of teachers, doctors, people working in the police, and so on. So there is a cost to not striking a deal. But as I say, the Chancellor's been very clear there is a process now of her looking at the pay review body's recommendations and then setting out to Parliament in the next couple of weeks what the response of the government will be.
All right, but just looking at it philosophically, people working in the public sector have not, under the Conservative government, managed to keep up in terms of pay with people in the private sector. Is it the philosophical position of the new government that they do need, the public sector does need to catch up?
Well, I think the position of the government is one of pragmatism and one of being realistic about the state of play that we've inherited. So as I said, with the Chancellor looking at the recommendations, that will be done in the context of the public finances that we've inherited. But actually, whether you work in the public sector or the private sector, we want to make people across Britain better off, which is why there's such a big focus in what we've been saying since the very first day of taking office about getting the economy growing. And on those first couple of days in office, over the first weekend after the election, the Chancellor, as I mentioned, asked Treasury officials to look at the state of public finances, but she also said to them, let's get on with growth, let's make those planning reforms, let's set up the National Wealth Fund. Today we're talking about our planned reforms to pensions. This is all about boosting investment and getting the economy growing, because if we can get the economy growing, it makes people across Britain better off.
You're helping pensioners, or you're planning on reforming pensioners, yet you don't seem to have a position on child poverty and certainly lifting the cap on two children child benefit. What's your answer to the rebellion, which is now across the Labour Party, ranging from Rosie Duffield to Jeremy Corbyn's former Shadow Chancellor?
I think what's really clear to me is that all Labour MPs believe that no child should grow up in poverty, and we all recognise that children's life chances are being scarred by rising poverty. It's a really important issue for us to address, and that's why the Prime Minister has set up a task force chaired by the Secretaries of State for Education and Work and Pensions to develop a child poverty strategy, which will be a comprehensive, ambitious strategy to tackle child poverty. In terms of the specific measure around the two-child limit, we can't promise to do anything where we can't say where the money would come from. And given the state of the public finances, that's why we're not able to make that promise, because we made very clear throughout the election campaign that we would never make promises, never make commitments where we can't say where the money would come from. And that's something which drives us in government too.
But do you accept the widespread analysis that the two-child cap is actually contributing to the increase in child poverty?
Well, I understand is the level of child poverty is at a level which is far too high, and far too many children are seeing their life chances scarred by poverty, and that's what we need to address. And that's why,
But
as I
there
said,
would
the
be a
child
way of
poverty
addressing
strategy
it,
is being
or
developed
do
at
you
pace.
think there's a better way of addressing it?
So that will be the work of the task force which is developing the strategy to set out our response. But let me be really clear that the reason why we can't make a commitment on the two-child limit is because we can't say where the money would come from, and we are never going to make any commitments where we can't say exactly where the money would come from. And I'll tell you why that's so important in the context of this discussion, because if you make unfunded spending commitments, we saw what happened when Liz Truss did that. It crashes the economy, it hurts everyone right across the country, but it particularly impacts the most vulnerable. So it is not in the interest of anyone, least of all those who care about child poverty and want to reduce it, to have any kind of unfunded spending commitments. And for us, economic responsibility, fiscal discipline, our spending rules, they are not a nice to have addition. They're absolutely central to what we want to do in government.
Yeah, but for example, on defence spending, you have said that it's your intention, you haven't set a date on it, but you said it's your intention to hit the 2.5% of GDP spending limit. I don't understand why you can't say, given the philosophical position of the Labour Party, that it is your intention in the course of this Parliament maybe to lift the two-child cap.
Well, on defence spending that you mentioned, the Prime Minister has launched a strategic defence review, and that will look in detail at the threats that we face and what we need to do, what capacities and resources we need, and we'll set out a pathway to that 2.5% of GDP being spent on defence. That's on the strategic defence review. At the same time, I've also mentioned the child poverty strategy, which the task force has already begun working on to develop, and that will set out a comprehensive approach.
I mean, I've got to ask you, I've got to say, we're not getting, frankly, very positive reactions to this interview coming in from our listeners. And I mean, how long can you just say, I haven't got any answers to any questions, but we're having a review? I mean, the point of being in government is to actually achieve something, isn't it?
Well, we've hit the ground running when it comes to getting the economy
You've
growing.
hit the ground.
We've already.
You've hit the ground launching reviews.
We overturned the ban on onshore wind energy in the first few days in office. We said we're going to reinstate housing targets. We've set up the National Wealth Fund. We've launched the recruitment for the Border Security Commander. Right across the piece, we have hit the ground running. There are some issues which are more complicated and which deserve a bit of attention. Well, there are some issues where you need a comprehensive response from across government, and we want reviews to make sure that we are directing the efforts of government in the right way. But let's take, for instance, the review of pension investment, which we've launched today. In response to that, many of the pension fund managers have saying this is really good. This is coming forward so quickly from the government because we want to make sure that we are getting better returns for pensioners on their savings, as well as using the assets in pension funds in productive activities to help drive growth in the UK economy.
But as has been pointed out by many economists, if you're investing in a pension fund, the UK has not performed as well as the United States or other places where you could invest, so why on earth should you?
Well, one of the issues that we face in the UK is, let's take defined contribution pensions as a starting point. By the end of the decade, there will be around £800 billion worth of assets in defined contribution pension schemes in the UK. What we're saying is that more of that money, more of those assets, should be invested in productive activities in the UK once it helps grow the economy, because that's good for economic growth. It's one of our key measures to boost economic growth across the country, but it's also good for pensioners because it increases the returns on their savings and means that they're in a better position when they retire.
Not if they can get better returns investing abroad.
Well, we're talking about what we can regulate and what we can do in terms of pension schemes within the UK. So defined contribution schemes. The other one is the local government pension scheme, where we know there's around £360 billion of assets within the local government pension scheme. We need to make sure, again, that is working better for savers, for the people who are members of those schemes, and also for the UK economy by investing more of those assets in productive activities which boost economic growth.
James Murray, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just a sample of some of your comments. Brilliant display by your guest at avoiding to answer any questions. What is the point of the government putting forward ministers for media interviews when they're never going to say anything meaningful in response to questions? Might as well have given this minister a lie-in on Sunday instead.
How many times did that guy from the Labour Party mention inherited with respect to the previous regime? I found it quite embarrassing. He didn't answer any other questions. Well, there